All right, welcome everyone. This is our 22nd episode of the Spiky Signal Show, where I sit down with some of the most exceptional revenue leaders in the revenue space. This podcast is meant for all of us to explore the biggest problems facing customer-facing teams, share the real challenges of sales, what revenue leaders deal with on an everyday basis, from pipeline visibility to coaching to deal velocity. We share it all here on the podcast. I'm your host, Waleed Shaarani, head of revenue at Spiky.ai, and today I'm here with CEO and founder Cliff Simon at Polaris. Today we're talking about building a system that always works and always learns. Cliff, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. Yeah,
Thanks for having me, Waleed.
absolutely. Awesome. Well, why don't you just give us a quick elevator pitch on who you are and what you do?
Hi, I'm Cliff Simon. I run a company called Polaris. We focus on helping companies activate the AI layer and make sure that they're doing that across the entire go-to-market stack.
And where were you at before this, Cliff? Like, kind of just tell me a little bit more about, like, over the past 10 years, what have you been up to and what have you done?
Sure, over the last 10 years, I spent the last almost 2 decades of my career in go-to-market, mostly on the sales side, and over the last 10 years, I've been a part of 0 to 10, and 0 to 15, and for the last 5 years prior to starting Polaris, I was with Carabiner Group, took them 0 to 8 in 20 months bootstrapped, and helped lead that team to a successful exit about
That's awesome.
18 months ago.
And kind of like over your, 20 years of experience, is that what kind of led you to starting Polaris? Was it more so you were seeing all these like go-to-market, systems that need to be set up in place? So did you end up taking that on because it excited you? Like what was the creation story behind your organization?
Yeah, so having been in the RevOps space for the last 5-6 years now, the things I kept hearing last year before I started Polaris was how difficult a time everyone was having with activating AI. What systems do they actually need? How does this all come together? And that's where we've really pivoted
That's
to
awesome.
and focused on. Keep hearing the same thing over and over again. It's got to
Well,
be real.
I'm going to start off with like a kind of like just a question around revenue systems overall. Where do you typically see things going wrong versus going right? Or like even when a revenue system fails, have you lived through that in past experiences? I guess with the companies that you're working with currently,
Sure.
what does that look like?
The most natural place where that fails is when you are far too focused on your own internal processes and not tying all those things back to the way that your customer operates and their actual buying journey. So that's like the baseline. I think the next part is when you continue to build systems for the way your process is today versus the way your process should be architected. So continually solving for symptoms and not for diseases.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Those signals, like what are like 2 or 3 signals that you typically look for to kind of like keep a revenue system kind of in place and actively working towards, achieving revenue goals?
A lot of it comes from creating the right baseline, having an understanding of what the definitions are of, and anything from like, what does a lead mean? What does it mean to create an opportunity? How do we walk things through the different deal stages? Having definitions of your entry and exit criteria, right? These are all really like simple baseline things, but most companies don't put them in place early enough, and they don't revisit them based off of where their customers are today. So this is something that is living and breathing, and you have to understand what that looks like and then be able to implement the appropriate execution of those things as those definitions change.
Yeah, makes a lot of
over time.
sense. I was talking to someone a couple weeks back, and he was saying that kind of the systems that you have in place and even people that you have in place under your revenue org, when it comes to a 5 million ARR org versus a 50 versus 100, is completely different, and they kind of all break at a particular level to graduate to the next one. Do you typically see like the same thing where it's like, hey, at this milestone of 5 million ARR, this is where we need to reconstruct things? or at this milestone of 10 million ARR, like we need to reconstruct things and be more optimized with our systems and workflows, or we need to hire a leader that's, a CRO, for example. Where do you typically see those milestones of kind of breaking and then rebuilding?
I think of it less in terms of ARR and more in terms of like where you are from a developmental perspective and what your go-to-market motion is. When you're thinking about these systems, you have to have the end goal in mind. So if the next goal is to get to a Series B or a Series A or to get acquired, understanding who and what that next step is helps you what's the word I'm looking for? Helps you, I'm looking at this. In order to get to that next phase, you need to be able to understand where you're going, and then you have to reverse engineer the process and pathing to get there. So what KPIs do you need to be able to track? What story are you going to need to be able to tell with that information? How does that allow you to service your customers better? And now you can start reverse engineering the blueprint for gathering that metadata, understanding it. How does that come together across multiple systems of record, systems of information, and systems of action? And now you have a blueprint.
Yeah.
Again, all of that in service of the customer journey.
I guess like the blueprint of what looked like 10 years ago as kind of optimal versus now is pretty much different, right? I mean, there's so many different, it's crazy. Like there's so many different AI tools that have come out just to let alone in the past year, right? And there's this like coin term, right, exactly. And there's like this coin term now that I think Clay came up with, which is like the go-to-market engineer, right? That didn't even exist 2 years ago or whatever. So what does that blueprint look like right now? Do you have to have your Clays? Do you have to have your kind of the sequencing tools that you're using? Do you have to have that enrichment tool that you're using? And do all of them need to speak to each other kind of at the same point and at the right time when you're pushing a prospect all the way through the sales cycle to get them to get closed? And then even after when they get closed, those tools, I'm assuming, need to be all connected to each other, right?
So all those different systems do need to be connected in one way, shape, or form. You have to be intelligent and intentional about the way that you're tying that together. I don't think we live in a world anymore where there is a single system of truth, as much as Salesforce or HubSpot would love that to be that. I think that information lives across a series of systems of record, whether that's your CRM, your ERP, your database, whatever that might be. And yes, we have to be able to enrich that data with technographic, firmographic, persona-based data, contact-based data. We also want all of the buying signals that we know lead to a higher likelihood of people converting, or the higher likelihood that they actually have a problem. Those are all great things to have, and we need to tie that back in. I think the most important part is just giving that information to the person that's actually talking to the customer so that they have the context, so they can have an intelligent conversation. How they get a hold of that person is going to be highly dependent on the persona they're going after, the industry they're in. Sometimes email works, sometimes in-person works, sometimes phone calls work, right? It's never, this is the one way. There's always multiple avenues to go forward. And then to your point about it going across the entire customer lifecycle, absolutely. You have to be able to understand what it looks like to interact with that client as they onboard. Make sure they get that time to value understood. Make sure that you're actually hitting an impact, because that's what's going to drive the recurring revenue that comes in.
That makes sense. And how go ahead.
I'll say, as far as like what's required, I think Clay is sort of like a quote unquote easy way to do it, but even Clay is not that simple to use. And I don't think Clay is the end all be all. There's plenty of different ways to slice this. And GTM engineering is new-ish. I think most of them are just the growth hackers of yesteryear, right? The ZERP era. They're figuring things out. But the challenge I see with most of the GTM engineers that are out there is that they don't have any idea how to tie the things that they're building, because that's what they like to do, right? They're tinkerers, by and large. They don't know how to tie the things that they're building back to business outcomes and business value. So it's a disconjointed role. I don't think the GTM engineer is a threat to RevOps. I think the GTM engineer is a portion of the roles to be done within a RevOps org.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of these, like, I guess, quote unquote influencers, go to market influencers that will be like, hey, look what I just built. I built this whole like 150 step workflow, and this is going to completely replace your whole RevOps team, right? I'm assuming it's not as easy. That's just all marketing kind of BS, right? How hard is it really to put in the correct infrastructure to get things going as a system?
I mean, it's stuff we're working on now with our clients, right? We're building those agents for people. It's incredibly difficult if you want to do a 150 step chain, right? And when I think of 150 steps, I think about that replacing a whole series of technology and probably like 3 or 4 humans that are typically in the loop. I think you can get a lot of work done by having a human on the loop and understanding what's going on, monitoring it, and running those agents like they are an internal team. Now, that can help with all kinds of tasks that are very well defined, things like enrichment, things like going out and gathering signals. But then you have to cross-verify a lot of the stuff that you're getting too, right? So, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to skin
that
these
makes
cats.
sense. And when it comes to, I guess, like, once you build out that 150 step workflow, how hard is it to change up certain things? Because I guess businesses are constantly changing, right? Especially in today's day and age. When you guys first built out those things, is it built with the understanding that, hey, this is going to be constantly changing and you need to make it more fluid? Is that how you guys approach those particular systems when you're building it?
For us, we take a DevOps approach. So we want to be able to take what we've built, put it out as a change set, and then if we need to make alterations, we have to make alterations not just to the actual agents, but to the documentation, right? So cloning it, testing it, rebuilding and reconfiguring. Maybe there's a piece of technology that's swapped out, right? And it used to be on an API key. Now we have to push it through an MCP. So there's things like that will inevitably happen.
What feedback loop?
I think you have to build for those eventualities.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, like, I'm trying to understand from these areas that you're building to understand, if there's a loop that's going to break or a thing that you need to update. What loops or learnings kind of...
Hey, could you ask that question again? Your audio cut out
absolutely.
for a little bit there.
I was asking what feedback loops kind of separate elite revenue organizations versus average ones.
Oh man, that's a great question. I think the companies and revenue teams that do it best are the ones that are constantly listening to their customers and either have a systemic way of doing it, right? So a series of team meetings, inter-team meetings, etc., or they're using technology to listen to those calls with the customers and drive the feedback loops appropriately, whether it's putting feature requests that are coming in consistently and tying that to a potential upsell value, expansion value, and then helping to tier roadmap based off of the likelihood of revenue that it would create, or you're taking the language that you're hearing from your customers and adjusting your copy, your positioning, and your messaging from a marketing perspective. Those things are so wildly important.
What and when it comes to building all this out, is there a particular ownership that is clearly defined with companies that own that system? I guess, like, traditionally it's RevOps, right? But do you see that changing, over time? Is that going to become more of like the CRO's capability? For example, like, I've been talking with a bunch of CROs, and they said that they've been a lot more hands-on with the revenue infrastructure that they've been putting in place. Especially, the mid-sized company CROs, I would say. You start to get to enterprise, it starts to get a little hazy up there, right? But are these kind of leadership roles changing, and who's going to own that revenue infrastructure?
I think it varies. So depending on what you're building, different folks might be owning the actual tactical implementation or the build out, while the CRO and the ELT sets strategy. I keep hearing of CEO after CEO asking, like, where are we using AI? How are we going to use AI? And I think to your point with this new breed of CROs is being asked very consistently and earnestly by their teams to figure this out. So folks are getting in, rolling their sleeves up and getting involved with the process because there's a need. I think the other part that drives that is it's easier now than ever to build versus buy. So does it make sense for you as a company to shed $250,000, $400,000 in SaaS contracts and spend a good chunk of that cash going out and building a product from an agentic perspective that actually is fit for purpose versus going out and buying a platform that you might only get 30 to 40% utilization out of? Or a series of platforms, right? And or headcount.
So. With the infrastructure in place, or I guess when you're approaching these clients and they say their challenges and you come to them and say, hey, we can set up this type of systematic approach to your revenue ops. Are there particular challenges that you see that you can't solve? For example, like I've seen that even before setting up a system in place, you have to have the right data, and it needs to be clean too, right? Because data in, data out, it's garbage if it's nothing.
Sure.
If it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So that's like one challenge I've mainly seen across a lot of these companies. Mm-hmm. Any other challenges you've seen?
I mean, I don't think the data in, data out is a challenge anymore. I think it's table stakes, right? For the ZERP era, it didn't matter if your Salesforce data was good. Everyone sort of just like did their thing. Now it's the baseline. You have to have good data because otherwise the agents won't work. You have to understand your labeling, how everything gets set up in rows and columns. Like, machines think like machines, so we have to be able to feed them the information in the way in which they can ingest it, right? I wouldn't go and give my kid a Ferrari and tell him to, my 6-year-old, and tell him to go drive it down the street. Like, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, cool. One last question for you. What's kind of like one infrastructure mistake that you've seen that quietly kills growth?
Over-engineering, too many automations really early on. I think that's sort of like the other side of this GTME thing, where you've got folks coming in and now you've got 1,000 zaps. You've tied all these things together, that someone comes in and makes a change, or you bring on, a new RevOps hire and they haven't had the opportunity to look through every single flow and automation that's been built, and they do one thing and now they've, either broken 20 others, or, you turn on the light switch and all of a sudden the dishwasher starts running, right? It's one of those kinds of situations. So the over-engineering, I think, is going to be a challenge. Again, because people are trying to build things to solve for a problem, but they're not understanding the full implication of what they are building and how that affects everything else.
Cool. Well, Cliff, really appreciate all your insights so far. This was really interesting, to be honest. I haven't really talked about systematic approach to RevOps with a leader yet, so this was an interesting take. For the next episode, do you know of anyone that would be a great revenue leader to bring on here? If you don't know top of mind, you can email me.
Sure. What topic?
Whatever topic. I mean, if you know anyone that's doing great stuff as a CRO or as a RevOps leader or as an enablement leader, happy to have them on here.
It was a conversation I had earlier today. One that might be very interesting is Andrea Kale from Help Scout, getting her on to talk about their switch from license-based to usage-based pricing.
Cool. I'll reach out to her then. Anyways, well, thank you so much, Cliff, for being on the podcast with me. Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Waleed. Appreciate it.